Good evening to all. So, welcome to the lecture number 7 on research and publication ethics. So, continuing from the point where I had left off the last lecture, where I was talking about certain undisclosed conflicts of interest and what should be the method or the course of action that is to be adopted by the journal editor in principle. So I will start at that point now and show you certain case histories of undisclosed conflicts of interest. So this undeclared conflict of interest, I have already informed that this competing or conflict of interest, they come to light after the publication of the paper. And because that happens, the editors are sometimes unwilling or uncertain of the process in order to issue a correction. So the two cases would be if this happens during the peer review itself, and the reviewers suspect an undeclared author conflicts of interest, they should inform the editor, who will follow the relevant guidelines given by Pope before continuing with the review. But after if the paper gets published and then some reader reports some possible undisclosed conflict of interest, then there's another process which is a little bit more detailed, which I had already shown you last time, and that has to be followed, and the journal has to issue a correction if it deems necessary, or sometimes it can even result in a retraction. So I'll try to give you one or two case histories of this undeclared conflict of interest. So there was one published study which actually reviewed the use of some particular device for performing a clinical maneuver. So this was a paper in probably a medical journal. So one of the authors, he actually worked for a consultancy. But when he was asked to declare at that point of submission of manuscript, he declared that he had no conflict of interest. So subsequently, the journal actually received a letter pointing out that the consultancy at whom this one of the authors was working had been actually set up explicitly to persuade governments and the regulatory organizations of the virtues of the new drugs and technologies. So then the editors felt that this was a conflict of interest, and that should have been actually declared. And then they asked the author if he agreed. So the journal's advice is that if there is any doubt, authors should declare an interest, as there are rarely any problems in taking this approach, because there's no harm in declaring any conflict of interest. Nothing is going to happen, except that if there is an issue, then journal editor himself will come back to the author and inform him that, look, this could have a serious implication. So then he cannot go ahead with the publication, or maybe he has to make some corrections, etc., etc. Okay. So the author, in fact, in this particular case, the author explained that he changed his job after carrying out the research and writing the paper at the address which, the affiliation which was given in the paper. But before the peer review and publication process started, he actually changed his job. So he has a new address. So what he did was the author cited his new address, the current address, as being the place of contact. So this involved probably some issue with ethics. So they felt that since the work was done at the previous place, and he must declare a conflict of interest at this point. And then, so the journal considers publishing a notice of undeclared interest, but the forum for COPE, they were asking whether they should do anything more. So in this case, I think the issue is that many authors, they are rather unclear as to what constitutes a conflict of interest. So there has to be some balance between exactly what should be declared and what could be declared. So in this particular case, of course, the journal does not need to take any further action other than what was suggested by the editor. And then also one possibility which the editor can do is to clear the air by publishing an editorial in the journal in order to help clarify the issue for authors who may have some doubts about or who may not know about what exactly this conflict of interest should constitute. So that would go a long way in helping authors to know whether they should be declaring any particular interest as a conflict of interest. So this was one of the case histories which I had planned. Then the another one was there was a paper on some controversial topic which had 3 authors and it was published. Then all the 3 authors had in fact completed COI forms to say that they did not have any competing interests. So this was also stated at the end of the paper which was published. Then some reader subsequently he contacted the journal to say that she had some very clear evidence that one of the authors in fact did have a competing interest. So she says that he had been involved in certain legal cases and also received financial consideration, that is substantial payments for his work. So the article related to these legal cases. So in fact, the article which was published related to certain legal cases which the particular author was dealing with, and he has not mentioned it, and he was also getting paid for it. So there is a very clear conflict of interest here. So the editor, what he wanted to do was to write to the complainant and then ask her permission to send a letter to the author. And if the author accepts that he did have a competing interest, then the journal will publish a statement saying so. So the question he put up to Cope was whether this is okay with Cope or should anything more be done. So Cope replies saying that the public has the right to know if there were conflicting interests and that if there was any doubt, it is better to disclose. So just because the material is in the public domain does not exonerate an author from declaring such interests. So ultimately, the decision which was taken was that the editor sent the complainant's letter to the author in question, after which a statement of competing interest was subsequently published in the journal. Then another case was that the author himself wrote a letter for publication to the journal on the importance of doing research on a long-established drug. And he did not declare any competing interest. But the editors were later informed that he was actually conducting a trial of the drug, and this trial actually was funded by a pharmaceutical company. So this was found when they made some inquiry. So the editors approached him and asked him to declare his competing interests. So the question which was put up to Cope was that, have the editors done the right thing? And should they do something more than simply asking him to declare his competing interest and publish the declaration in the journal? So the Cope committee replies saying that the author did not think he had a competing interest. It was agreed it was beneficial to publish statements of competing interest with a paper or a letter. Otherwise, authors might think this is an optional requirement. So that means along with any publication, manuscript which is submitted, it is mandatory to fill up the competing interest form. Whether or not you have an interest or not, you have to declare either you have an interest or you don't have an interest. So it's not an optional requirement, it's a mandatory requirement. So a statement of declaration of competing interest was subsequently published, which mentioned that this had been omitted because of naivety. And the editor later published a paper in 2001 on competing interests, highlighting journal policies on the issue. That's also a very commendable thing to do because the editor would like to bring it into the public domain. So what are the issues on regarding the conflict of interest and how authors should take care of such things, and also what would be the journal policies on the matter. Then there's another case history of undeclared conflict of interest, where the journal Nature actually had to correct a paper on fish farming. And this happened after the journalist actually pointed out that the first author in that paper had undisclosed ties to the agribusiness giant Cargill. So Cargill is a huge business house in the area of agriculture and things like life sciences. So at the time, the reporter, whose name was Tim Schwab, he noted that several of the other authors also appeared to have undeclared conflicts of interest, but the journal had not taken any steps to eliminate those. So almost about 9 weeks later, Nature decided to update its original correction to the article, which is named as a 20-year retrospective review of global aquaculture, which found that the practice of fish farming has become significantly more friendly to the environment than it was 2 decades ago. So now the Nature actually made a publisher correction, and in fact, it's a very big detailed statement comprising about 615 words. So, so that's how cases of undeclared conflict of interest take place. And very rarely, sometimes, if the conflict of interest is extremely high, then in fact they may have to withdraw the or retract the paper also, because it becomes almost like a legal issue. So this is the course of action which the journals take whenever a conflict of interest, an undeclared or undisclosed conflict of interest cases come up after a particular paper has been published in the journal. So, so now we move on to the next topic, that is, last time we did this conflict of interest. So now this time it will be publication misconduct and issues leading to unethical behavior and violation of publication ethics. So most of the cases which I had discussed in my previous lectures dealt with cases of misconduct during the course of the research methodology itself. Of course, those scientific misconducts which would have been carried out during the course of the research methodology also would have an implication when a manuscript is written up at the end of that research activity and the analysis of the data. So they will have a direct bearing on the publication misconduct also. Let's see how these publication misconduct is defined and dealt with. So whenever a scientific misconduct takes place while reporting the results or presenting research results, it is deemed as publication misconduct. And this scientific misconduct could be FFP, which is fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism, selective reporting, which I have described in one of my earlier lectures, authorship demands, this I have not yet talked about. I'll touch upon this a little bit in this lecture, but in the next lecture, this I'll take up in more detail. Then unethical or reciprocal reviewing, this also I'll try to take up in this lecture itself. Then editorial bias, conflict of interest, misleading data or data misinterpretation, which I talked about, and credits in a publication, etc. Then improper ethical clearances. This also I had briefly talked about in one of the previous lectures. Then personal bias and several more. So, in fact, it's actually noticed that most of these misconducts can be actually prevented if there is a proper code of conduct or proper guidelines are adopted by all the institutions and research laboratories well in advance. So it is very important that all research laboratories and academic institutes, organizations have these specific codes of conduct and guidelines, because these guidelines can vary from institution to institution depending upon the area of research that particular institution undertakes. So each institution has to frame these codes of conduct and guidelines for their academic employees. So again, see, when all these institutions, they devise these codes of conduct, again, they can take the help of statutory bodies like COPE or things like that, or VAME, etc. And they have their broad guidelines. They can adopt those broad guidelines and also bring in some specific guidelines which are specific to that particular institution. So what are the results of these misconducts? So this misconduct can actually harm the research community, and they can cause loss of trust in journals and research itself. Then they can cause damage to careers of people, including those of some innocent collaborators who probably and colleagues who were not aware of a certain misconduct committed by a particular person in the group. And in turn, they can cause damage to institutions' reputations. Because whenever a person working under a particular institution indulges in scientific misconduct, not only the person's name gets affected, but even the institution's reputation also will get affected. Then corruption of the evidence base, because whenever there's a misconduct, one very thing which is done often is to destroy the data which is not good or which has been used to fraudulently do some research and all those things. Then, of course, all this will also result in a waste of time for everyone, time, effort, and funds, not only for the institution, for the collaborators, for the scientific journal which is taking up the manuscript. All these efforts will just come to a knot at the end when this misconduct is discovered. Then the participants in the research trials, this is more relevant for the medical field, where you have humans as participants in the research trials. So if there is an unethical research which is adopted by the scientists, can actually result in harm to these participants who are participating in these research trials. Then, of course, the general public. And how does this affect the general public? Because whatever is published in the science field, ultimately it percolates down to the society. So based on certain findings, research findings, you can also get some policy which is framed on basis of that, or some practice which is adopted based on a certain scientific finding. Now, if that particular finding happens to be fraudulent, now you can see that how much damage it can do to the policy. Because the policy which has been unknowingly framed on a fraudulent scientific outcome. Then it can also result in misdirecting the future research because many people take the scientific findings and papers as starting points for further research. And of course, it will also affect the funding. So then who are the people who commit these misconducts? Well, literally everyone involved in the scientific process. So it starts with authors and researchers. And what are the types of misconduct they can commit? Unethical research, which I already talked about in my previous thing. So unethical research, then fabrication and falsification and plagiarism. Falsification of data includes, of course, image manipulation, which is very often seen in biological journals, biological and medical journals. Selective reporting, I have also talked about how selective reporting can affect results, because everyone, as I said, likes to see only good data. No one wants to see bad data or negative results. So everyone really loves good data. So, and then of course, redundant publications or duplicate publications, which I have discussed, salami slicing or whatever you want to call it. Then inappropriate authorships. So this is something which I have not talked about. I'll be dealing with this more in the next lecture. And so basically, authorship issues and how they affect scientific conduct. So they can result in misconduct also. Then they have what are called gift and ghost authorships. I'll talk about this later. Then undeclared conflicts of interest, which I have already talked about just now. And then manipulated referee addresses. This is a very, very horrendous thing to do. And people have been indulging in this. I'll try to explain what this means shortly. Then editors. Editors also can commit misconduct. So this editorial misconduct includes bias in selection, that is selection of manuscripts. Very often people in the third world say that editors of Western journals, Western country journals, they have a bias against Asian bylines, especially Indian bylines. Then preferential treatment for friends and colleagues. So this has also been seen very often when you see that papers on a similar research work have a higher probability of getting accepted if they happen to be emanating from some European laboratory or an American laboratory. So you can have certain preferential treatments by the concerned editors. And the editor also may decide that if some of his friends or colleagues, the editors, as I said, they are also scientists. So he will have plenty of friends, scientific friends in the field. So he may also try to give a preferential treatment for them. Then breaching confidentiality. So all this process, once the manuscript reaches an editor's office, all the process which undergoes after that has to be absolutely confidential. Who are the referees? What are the referee reports? And what are the referee comments to the editors? So all these are actually confidential things. So if these matters are leaked out, so that would mean breaching of confidentiality. Then intentional delays for rivals. So if the editor happens to get for refereeing or something, a paper from a rival, which has been submitted to a rival journal, he may intentionally delay it also, just because he wants his own journal to prosper as compared to other journals. Then reviewers. Reviewers also can commit a lot of issues, frauds. So plagiarism is one very common thing which reviewers do. That is, whenever they get a manuscript for review, instead of doing an honest review of the manuscript and sending it back to the editor, I mean, if they happen, this happens especially when they are in the same field of research. So if they happen to be in a similar field, or if they're doing exactly a similar problem, they may simply steal the ideas from these papers and do on their own, work on their own, the ideas, the text, or even the data. And reviewers also can have undeclared conflicts of interest. They can also breach confidentiality. Whenever a reviewer gets a paper, manuscript for review, he should not be informed, even if he finds that the author, one of the authors or some authors of the manuscript happen to be his friends, he cannot disclose that he has received his friend's paper for review. That will be absolutely unethical. Or he can also cause intentional delays by holding back a review just because he is also probably working on the same problem. Then the publishers can also create certain frauds, and of course, this are much at a higher level. And they also include plagiarism, conflicts of interest, confidentiality, and all this delays, etc. Then some of the funding agencies, of course, this doesn't happen much in our country, but abroad in the West, this is a possibility where the funding agencies, they try to influence the outcomes of the research which they are funding. So they can actually suppress inconvenient results, negative results. They can also, if they want, delay publications or prevent authors from having access to the data. They can also attempt to bias the presentation of the research findings which come out from the research activity. And they may also not disclose their involvement properly. That's also like a conflict of interest. So these are some of the people who can commit publication misconduct. So one point which I talked about in the earlier slide was manipulated referee addresses. So I wanted to inform you about the possibility of how this can happen. So I start with the case history and then I'll discuss how this actually happens. So one of the editors or a co-editor of a journal, he has written, recently as co-editor, I received a manuscript submitted for publication. The author had recommended 2 reviewers along with their Gmail accounts and affiliations. So this co-editor was a smart guy. He says, I was curious to know about the affiliation of one of the reviewers. I looked this person up probably on the internet, and he discovered that he had a different email address than that which was provided by the author. So I used the email address that I found in the internet to contact that particular reviewer, which he calls as reviewer 1. And for the second recommended reviewer, reviewer 2, he also looked up a current email address and used the one which he found on the internet instead of the Gmail address that was provided by the author along with his manuscript. So what was the result? The reviewer 1 responded with the comment that the title of the manuscript looked similar to a manuscript review that he had been asked to confirm for another journal, which he calls it as Journal 1. And this reviewer 1 asked me to contact the editor of the Journal 1. So after contacting the editor of Journal 1, I discovered that the author had provided bogus email accounts for the recommended reviewers. So the editor of Journal 1 immediately became suspicious of the reviews when he received a review within hours of the request to review the manuscript. It was at this point that the editor of Journal 1 discovered that the email addresses provided were bogus. And reviewer 2 declined my request to review the manuscript. And to test that, the Gmail address which was provided by the author was bogus, I sent a request to review the manuscript to reviewer 2's bogus Gmail account. So within hours, I received a review. I then called the reviewer 2 to confirm that he or she had not provided a review. So in fact, he has not. And he was very concerned that a Gmail account was created using that particular person's name. So the Pope Forum agreed that this case was brought about by the failure of the journal processes and the peer review system. So what is the problem here? What is the failure of the journal process or the peer review system? See, some of the journals, when you submit a manuscript to that journal, what they do is the normal procedure is that the reviewers for a particular manuscript have to be chosen by the editor of the journal. And these reviewers, in principle, have to be experts in that particular area of research. But the issue here is that, especially with popular journals, say for example, like Physical Review B, for Physical Review B, for example, every year Physical Review B publishes roughly about 4,000 to 5,000 papers. So if they are publishing 4,000 to 5,000 papers, what it means is that probably they'll be receiving at least 4 to 5 times those numbers as manuscripts per year. So what does that mean? It means that per day, they may be having almost 100 manuscripts being received at their offices. So when you have 100 manuscripts, 50 to 100 manuscripts coming per day in a journal's editor's office, now imagine the load on the editor's office to process the manuscripts, then assign referees to the manuscripts for refereeing. So it has a lot of, it takes a lot of time. So some of the journals, what they have tried to do is that to reduce the time and hunting time for the correct referees, they suggest to the author at the stage of submission itself that he could give or suggest names of 3-4 suitable or appropriate referees for that manuscript. So this is all in good faith. So the author also in good faith should in principle behave ethically and give proper names along with email addresses. But this is where is the catch. Unfortunately, the misconduct creeps in at this stage where the author, instead of giving proper information, what he tries to do is that he'll give the name of some known person in the area, but the email address for that person, he will give some bogus email address which may actually belong to himself. So this is a very horrendous practice. Okay. So this is how this problem occurs, where we have suggested reviewers. So the good practice is always to check the names, addresses, and email contacts of reviewers, especially those that are recommended by authors. And editors should never use only the preferred reviewer all the time. So while the forum recognizes that finding reviewers can be difficult and the peer review system can be hard, simple checks can avoid such situations in future. And it was also agreed that the publisher should take some responsibility, as it is their duty to support their editors, and the editorial office clearly needs guidance and step-by-step procedures in this case. So also then there is an issue of the author trying to defraud the system. The advice was to continue and try and contact the author and the author's institution and inform them of the situation, explaining the author's inappropriate and possibly criminal behavior. Why is it criminal? Because he is actually committing a fraud of identity. The author should be told that if no response is received, then the previous paper will also be retracted. Or the other advice was to consider re-reviewing the published article again. Then there's another case where a manuscript was flagged to editor, we call it him as X, as having received the reviewer's reports indicating very high interest. So at that point, the manuscript had been through one round of review, revision, and re-review, and all the three reviewers were advising that the manuscript be accepted without any further revision. So then what happened? On checking the credentials of the three reviewers, the editor X was unable to find a publication record of any of those reviewers. And all the three reviewers were found to have been suggested by the authors. And the institutions were given for the suggested authors, but the supplied email addresses were all with webmail services. The reviewers were found not to exist. So this is something very terrible. So the associate editor Y had invited the author. I mean, see, the actual case of what happened was the associate editor, in fact, invited the author's suggested reviewers and two of their own choosing. So totally 5 reviewers were actually asked whether they can review the manuscript. So the persons whom the associate editor had chosen himself, they did not reply to the invitation. They did not accept review. So after it was determined that the reviewer suggestions were faked, a previous publication by the same authors with the same fake reviewers was also identified, and that was also retracted, in fact. So recommendations of COPE regarding a similar recent case, which I discussed earlier, all of the authors were contacted to ask if they could supply more details of the suggested reviewers, and they have not responded, naturally. So we have attempted to find a contact at the author's institution. So what did the editors do? They tried to contact the institution, the author's institution, to file a complaint or something like that, or know more about this case. It proved difficult to identify a research ethics committee in that institution. And any individual senior member of the university or contacts for the university administration. So nothing was available. And during some other searches, a vice principal of the university was identified, but was found to be the senior author on both the manuscripts. So now what do you do? So we are now seeking guidance on the best course of action with regard to both the unpublished and published manuscripts in the absence of any response from the authors and no reliable contacts at the author's institution. Our current intention is to reject the manuscript under review and also issue a retraction of the published article. So these two cases highlight how the author himself can manipulate the peer review process. So it is, of course, it's a matter of luck for the author that ultimately whoever he suggested were in principle contact. I mean, the email addresses which he gave, they were contacted through those email addresses. He was, up to that point, he was lucky. But unfortunately, the author, he was found out, and the fraud was detected well in time, at least in this particular case. So now you can see to what extent people can go to commit scientific fraud. And again, the various reasons why people do this, again, is a philosophical question, which many people have discussed, and this is a question which is being talked about, and basically how to prevent such frauds from happening. So what happened was, in summary, this particular author has been creating false email accounts for suggested reviewers, which are going to unknown individuals who are providing reviews under false pretenses, and giving inaccurate information as to their identity and affiliation. The outcome of this is that my fellow co-editor and I have banned this individual from publishing in our journal. You see the sentence which they have delivered. So this particular author will be unable to publish in future in that particular journal. The author, not only this, the author has also been banned from publishing in Journal 1. So is there any more additional advice that COPE can give in this regard? The forum agreed that this was a serious form of misconduct and may be even criminal, as the author was in fact impersonating the reviewers. So finally, the editor reported that the author had his papers published in another journal, and he plans to write to the other editor asking him to check the reviewers on the manuscripts. So, as I said, why do people indulge in this kind of misconducts? So, and what are these misconducts? We have this ambiguous details in ethical applications with room for varied interpretation about study details. So what does this mean? Suppose you want to work on some biological tissue or whatever, some samples, you have to approach certain ethics committees, especially if it involves human tissue or animal tissue, etc. There are certain ethics committees, medical ethics committees. So now what happens is that in principle, for every sample which you want to undertake in the study, you have to get the appropriate ethics committee approval. But this is a tedious process, of course. So what do these, some of the scientists, what they do is they try to get one approval for one sample, but then probably use the same sample. So whenever there's an approval which comes from an ethics committee, it is very detailed. So it will specify how that sample has to be used, under what conditions, etc., and approve whatever has been asked for in that application. After due consideration, that only is approved. So you cannot use that particular sample in any other study or any other location, etc. Everything has to be as per that particular application. But since these applications are quite tedious, what people do is they take the same sample and then repeat it in several other studies also, citing the original ethics committee clearance. Okay. Then sometimes it can also happen that an ethics committee approval is sought after the particular study is been performed. And then again, sometimes deliberately ignoring and hiding findings to enhance the impact of the publications. Again, this is what I said is preventing negative results from coming out, or outliers, removing the outliers. Then using junior academics to carry out or help in expanding their own research program, or offloading teaching duties to mentees. So this is another problem which you find pretty often in academic circles, where the professors, especially if they're extremely busy people, people of very high standing and all those things, they have a lot of things to do, very important things to do. So in fact, I did talk about one Japanese professor who was caught in a plagiarism or a fabrication case. And the explanation he gave was that, look, I don't have time to visit my lab every day. So I leave all the work to the postdoc who is in the lab, who will accordingly instruct the PhD scholars. And so I don't know what actually happens in the lab. So it's like that. So trying to shirk the responsibility. But then his name is there in all the publications. Okay. So this is simply shirking of responsibility. Then sometimes they demand authorship from mentees' work or publication without any input into the research. This also you find, fairly often in our country also, you have to put the names of certain individuals, whether they have in fact participated in that particular research work or not. And then this has to be done for some non-academic or non-research reasons. Then expecting certain individuals such as professors and postdocs to have authorships in every single manuscript produced within a laboratory. So this is another practice which is a pernicious practice, but unfortunately it happens. And then selecting applications from mentees or collaborators to offer internal funding. So this is like a financial conflict. Okay. And so these are the different types of misconduct and causes for these misconducts. Then you can also purposely delay reviewer decisions to make sure that their own papers are published first. This I had talked about in the earlier slides. Then agreement between academics to be friendly reviewer on manuscripts of each other. So simply I scratch your back and you scratch my back. So you are the reviewer for your friend and your friend is the reviewer for yourself. Then the last one, which is authors purposely identifying themselves within the manuscript by quoting their previous publication. See, what is this? This is a case of a double-blind review process. So this usually doesn't happen in the fields of, say, physics, chemistry, or mathematics, for example, but it happens pretty often in the medical field, where the names of the authors are not supposed to be disclosed to the referees, and the names of the referees also will not be disclosed to the authors. So it's a double-blind review process. But then this has really not much meaning, because within the manuscript, whatever the text of the manuscript, you simply write a term saying that our previous study so-and-so has shown, and you give a reference. So it's immediately noticed that, look, this particular study has been done by so-and-so person. And also these days, research fields are so specialized that it's not too difficult to find out who are the authors of a particular research work. Okay. Then also we have other kinds of causes like social influences, plain greed, then ego of the person, then monitoring and moral reminders. Of course, this monitoring and moral reminders, in fact, they work to prevent misconduct. Self-justification and self-view, then self-control depletion, confidence depletion, and a slippery slope effect. So once you start doing it, you go down the slope. Then loss aversion, goal setting, and time pressure. So it is found that exposure to in-group members who misbehave or to others who benefit from unethical actions, greed or egocentrism, etc., they actually increase unethical behavior. Okay. But in contrast, monitoring the employees and giving them moral reminders time to time, and also if you allow the individuals to maintain a very positive self-view, this will actually work to decrease unethical conduct. So what should various journals do when they encounter misconduct? So journals must have robust and well-described practices for all the areas within the COPE core practices. And see, as I said, I have been drawing heavily from the COPE Committee on Publication Ethics, because now these are sort of the gold standard for scientific and publication ethics to be followed in all the laboratories as well as the journals themselves. In fact, COPE has been actually founded mainly for the journals, but now many people other than journals are also members of COPE. Then journals should be transparent about their processes and business practices according to the principles of transparency and best practice in scholarly publishing. So COPE expects journals to apply these principles in publishing practice also. So then you must have very clear and transparent policies in place to describe requirements for authorship and contributorship. So these policies for authorship and contributorship I'll be discussing in the next lecture. The peer review processes, which I talked about quite a bit. So including what is peer reviewed, what model of peer review is used, and how the process is managed must be fully transparent. So when you say transparent, it has to be transparent to the author also. That means authors should know, authors who submit a manuscript to the journal, they should know in what way the journal will proceed with their manuscript. Okay. So this was never the case earlier. So now, because of all these issues, it is now becoming more and more, the whole thing is becoming more and more transparent. Then the journals must have processes in place to respond to allegations of research, publication, and review misconduct, whether they happen before or after publication. And then journals should clearly describe definitions of what and how conflicts of interest must be disclosed by authors, by the reviewers, by the editors, by the journals themselves, and the publishers. So each entity here, which I've described, must have a certain clear definition of conflict of interest declaration. Then requirements of data availability, use of reporting guidelines, and registration of clinical trials and other study designs should be clear in the journal guidelines. Now, what do you mean by this data availability? See, as compared to the earlier days, when you say publish some research in some journal, you publish certain data, graphs, etc., based on certain data. Now, earlier days, the journal, when the manuscript comes to the journal, they only look at the graphs. They don't know what is the data behind each graph. But now it is important that the data also must be made available if required to the journal. So there are two options for authors nowadays. The authors can give the data into a data repository of the journal, where it is available if required to the reviewer or any other future reader if the manuscript is accepted for publication. Or the author can actually say or make a statement saying that, look, I will not keep the data with you in your repository. The data is available with me. In case anyone wants to have a look at the data, it will be provided to them. So this declaration also has to be made at the time of submitting a manuscript. So this is something which was not there earlier. And then journals must publish very clear guidelines on the ethical conduct of research according to the given research discipline. Then the copyright and publishing licenses must be very clearly described. Okay. And then in case if there's any author or reader fees. See, now many journals, they have two options for publishing a paper. You can actually make a payment, which is called publication charges to the journal. If that is done, the paper gets into print faster. Or, okay, you may choose not to pay the publication charges, after which the manuscript is kept in a general queue, and it will take a bit of time before it appears in print. There are also other journals which are called open access journals, like Nature or Science or scientific reports, such journals, they have also a policy of open access. That means you can pay a certain amount to the journal, after which the paper, when it is published, it is available to anyone who for download for everyone. It is available for download for anyone and everyone who accesses that particular journal site. Otherwise, you may have to require a subscription to that journal to access on the internet. Like for example, in most of our DA institutions, the libraries actually subscribe to have subscriptions with journals, internet subscriptions through which you can download the required publications. So, but this happens to the institution. So it's called an institutional access. So that's how you pay the money for getting this access. Then the transparency of journal management also is required, including the business model which the journal adopts, policies, processes, and also the software for efficient running of the journal. Then also finally, the journals must describe how they manage the post-publication debate and perform corrections and retractions. And the publisher and the journal must have certain guidelines in place to handle complaints against the journal, its staff, or members of the editorial board or the publisher himself. So what it means is that all the parties involved must have or must be given an equal opportunity to represent or present their cases. So, violation of publication ethics. So, what is this? Any activity that might vitiate the publication process, this could be termed as a violation of publication ethics. So, one of the authors, he has described this in these terms. The major problems with respect to publication ethics were plagiarism and multiple submissions in the 3 journals. When the authors, of course, they were talking about a particular case study in this paper. And so they did a case study with 3 journals. So when the authors were challenged, many of them did not reply. And they wrote back saying that they would like to withdraw the manuscript. Or they claimed ignorance or blamed their lack of English language skills. So these are all what are called convenient excuses. Many authors, in fact, had copied the text from published articles with citations and pasted them under the discussion section. To avoid delay in getting the manuscripts published, the authors indulged in multiple submissions. So this is another problem. The multiple submissions is almost impossible to detect while the manuscript is being processed. What do you mean by these multiple submissions? So you have written, you have done some research on something, some problem, and it has resulted in some manuscript. The data has been written up into a paper. What some smart people do is they make 3-4 copies of the manuscript and simultaneously send them to 2 or 3 journals, hoping that one of them will click and it will get accepted. This is an unethical practice actually, because when the manuscript is accepted in one journal, what the authors will do is they will withdraw the same manuscript from the other journals, stating that the manuscript processing cycle is too long or some other such reason, excuse which they give, and they say that they don't want to wait. So when an author submits a manuscript to a scholarly journal, he should actually declare that the manuscript is currently not under consideration for publication elsewhere. But many people do not hesitate to violate this kind of declaration. And also, to avoid delay in getting manuscripts published, authors indulge in multiple submissions. This multiple submissions is almost impossible to detect, as I said. So, yeah, so unrelated or inappropriate affiliations also cannot be verified. This is another problem because the author can give certain affiliations which are all not existing or not there in the internet or not possible to find out. So then it also becomes a problem because the journals should know where the particular manuscript has originated from. So the authors should give proper affiliation where the particular research work has been carried out. And when authors fail to submit evidence of ethics committee permissions on certain occasions, it is difficult to decide whether any violation of research ethics was actually involved. Then what is this prevalence and frequency of misconduct? It is actually really hard to estimate the prevalence of misconduct because nobody is going to admit openly that I have indulged in scientific misconduct. So various surveys have been tried and then they produce different results, probably because they also use different methods and different definitions of what is scientific misconduct. For example, asking researchers directly whether they have committed misconduct or not, they may not give accurate results. Similarly, we do not know how much misconduct actually goes undetected. The frequency with which misconduct is detected can be actually estimated from various sources, but just as different methods produce different estimates, they also produce different answers. So one society, PubMed, it showed that retractions were about 0.02%. Then ORI, it showed that the retractions were in the range of 0.01 to 0.01%. So that's 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 100,000 scientists. And then image manipulation in a particular journal of cell biology is around 1%. And then FDA audit, okay, that means investigators guilty of serious scientific misconduct showed it as 2%. But these numbers are, again, depending on the response you get from the field, and the suspicion is that the numbers could be much more than what has been given here. So we cannot be really precise about how often misconduct occurs, but the Fanelli system, Fanelli is the person, Daniel Fanelli, one of whose graphs I had shown in one of the earlier lectures. The systematic review suggests about 2% of research may actually commit fabrication or falsification. And analysis of image manipulation at the Journal of Cell Biology found 1% of images have been inappropriately altered. So the problem is that human nature is flawed, and the temptation to cheat, fabricate, falsify, or plagiarize, coupled with degrees of arrogance and greed, will indeed always remain with us. That temptation will, from time to time, fail to be resisted. The research community needs mechanisms that will minimize the occurrence of research misconduct and also mechanisms to deal with it responsibly and expeditiously whenever it occurs. So this was by Frank Wells in his article on fraud and misconduct in biomedical research. So finally, can journals prevent misconduct? So by authors, journals can discourage and prevent misconduct on part of authors by providing information, raising awareness, listing their contributions. They can ensure a requirement of conflict of interest disclosures, appropriate approval standards for research, and adherence to reporting guidelines. And they can also encourage post-publication debate and provide guidance on authorship issues. And they can also screen for plagiarism, redundancy, and image manipulation. And misconduct by reviewers. Journals should discourage and prevent misconduct on part of reviewers by requiring conflict of interest disclosures and explaining expectations regarding confidentiality. And misconduct by editors, they should prevent misconduct on part of editors by having processes for the handling editors and other board members conflicts of interest and publishing conflicts of interest for all decision-making editors. Thank you very much. So please let me know if there are any questions which I can answer. Yeah. Is it okay to reference on paper if the manuscript study is following the previous study, one which is being referred, and it is necessarily to understand the present work. Yes, of course, you have to provide a reference to your own paper, saying that it is under publication or or submitted to a particular journal. So one manuscript is submitted once to some journal, so you consider it as a manuscript under submission. So that is the reference which is to be given, or some journals will call it as, you have to term it as results unpublished or unpublished results. If two or more independent authors happen to submit their manuscripts incidentally on a similar topic in almost similar timeline, how would it be treated? This, in fact, happened, I think, long back. If you look at Marie Curie, I think this was the case. Yes, what happens is that you have two independent people working on the same problem, and they submit the results, which are very similar, and submit them to maybe even the same journal. So here it simply, what matters is that who is the first person to reach the editor's desk. That's number one. The other thing is that one has to also see whether this particular manuscript has been uploaded on a preprint archive, like say condensed matter archive or astrophysics archive. If that has been done, that timestamp will be also taken into consideration whenever, if both these manuscripts are to be accepted, then the editor will have to look at all these timestamps, like whether it has been submitted earlier, uploaded earlier as a preprint somewhere. See, this was the case I told you about, the water on the moon case. There's so many people working on the same problem. ISRO was working on the same problem. NASA was working on the same problem. ISRO found actually, in principle, the water on the moon earlier than NASA. But the tragedy was that they never bothered to upload their results in a preprint archive or leave a preprint archive. They didn't even bother to upload the result on their ISRO newsletter. That also would have ensured a timestamp for them. And this happened, in fact, to me also. Once I had some results which I got from my experiment here at Dhruva, and I found that it was quite interesting. And this, of course, happened unintentionally, that I presented them in my institute newsletter, and it appeared along with the graph. And then later I found that after about 4-5 months, there was a paper in the physical review on exactly the same compound, and they in fact referred to our newsletter saying that this measurement has been performed earlier by so and so person. So that's how it works. So whenever two manuscripts happen to reach the editor's office, in fact on the same day, of course, the editor takes a decision, because you never know which one actually has reached this table first. Okay, so you have to trust the journal. Yeah, any other question, please? Okay, no more questions. Thank you again. And in case you have any more questions, you are most welcome to write to me by email for more clarity. Thank you very much.